What's up, guys? It's the Bluebloods coming at you with another episode today. We're continuing our Big 10 and 31 days theme here, and we are joined by Zach Osterman, who covers the Indiana Hoosiers and college sports for the Indy Star. And I just wanted to say I appreciate you joining me today.
No, thanks for having me. Always fun to talk football.
Oh yeah, for sure. And so I feel like we got to start with last year. The Hoosiers went 6-2, were a top 10 team at times this year. And then COVID canceled some games. We saw Michael Penix go down with an injury, put a small damper toward the end of the season, but they recovered real nicely after the injury, winning all the way up until their bowl game. Did this season exceed, meet, or fall short of your preseason expectations?
Well, I don't think there's any question. I think it exceeded everybody's, preseason expectations. And obviously, I think we all expected it to be, a strange season with some strange results. And, I think everyone, broadly speaking, expected Indiana to be good. They'd gone 8-4 the previous season. They returned the lion's share of their production on both sides of the ball. But to kind of accomplish that much that quickly, I think was maybe the surprise, and to just be so, consistently competitive, obviously all the way up until the bowl game, which I think remains a disappointment for people within the program, but not one that necessarily, detracts or subtracts from the excitement of the season. The reality is, as strange of a year as it was certainly one of the banner years in IU football history for a variety of different reasons. And I think that's, even those of us, including me, that thought Indiana would be good in 2020, probably didn't quite see that coming.
Right. And, that season was kind of led on. I mean, the explosion of Michael Penix Jr. onto the college football scene. I heard about this kid. I knew he was good, but I don't think anyone expected to do what he did, throwing for over 500 yards in Columbus, being the heart and soul of this team, scoring the game-winning two-point conversion against Penn State. What makes him such a special quarterback, and what are your expectations for him coming off a big injury like he had last year?
Well, that's going to be interesting. I mean, certainly you saw what Michael Penix was capable of in his redshirt freshman season. If anything, there were ways in which he wasn't as good last year as he was in 2019. And I suspect a fair bit of that is down to just Indiana sort of having to water some parts of its offense down, because COVID meant that the way you practiced, the way you prepared. I mean, there was a point, Tom Allen remarked at one point, I think late in the offseason, that they couldn't have 5 offensive linemen in the same drill together because of COVID protocols, and the degree to which they wanted to keep people separate, and their little sort of workout pods distanced from one another. And so I think there were a lot of programs, including Indiana, that almost just sort of had to say, we're kind of going to go all in on this small fundamental number of things that we think can really work for us, because we don't have time to get really layered and install our entire playbook and go on and on and on. But I think you still saw what you saw more of. There was kind of an efficiency to Michael Penix's game as a redshirt freshman. I think what you saw more, at least anecdotally, in his sophomore year, was his explosiveness. The Ohio State game being the obvious example, but even if you look at what he did toward the end of the game against Penn State, what he did against Michigan, what he did against Michigan State, you see why. Really, from the time he got on campus, he enrolled early in January 2018, and from that moment, Indiana staff has been pretty consistent, and not necessarily piling pressure onto him, but in terms of not shying away from talking about how good they think he can be. And, we're talking about a kid who in 2019 beat out a returning starter for that quarterback job, and Peyton Ramsey, obviously a very good quarterback in his own right, Peyton Ramsey. And I think that what you really kind of, the only really big question with Penix will be the injuries, and obviously coming off the ACL again, and, having had some other injury, issues, a shoulder thing and all that, can he get to a point where physically, he can take that wear and tear, because obviously even as IU improves, it's not like they're going to go an entire season without allowing a sack, without allowing their quarterback to get hit. So if they can keep him healthy, and he's expected to be healthy for the start of the regular season, he'll be active in spring, but limited as you'd expect. If they can keep him healthy and given a much more sort of normal year for Nick Sheridan to kind of develop the whole offense, not just maybe specific pockets of it, I think, I think he genuinely has a chance to be the best quarterback in the Big Ten. Justin Fields is going now. I'm not saying he will be, but I think he'll be in that conversation now that Justin Fields is moving on to the NFL.
Right. I think he will be as well. I had him number 2 last year behind Fields and what he did, as we can imagine. But on the other side of the football, an underrated aspect of Indiana I don't feel like got enough respect was this top 20 defense. They were top 20 in scoring defense. That's a long ways from the 120th ranked defense that was there before Tom Allen took the head coaching job. Tywan Mullen might be my favorite defensive player in the Big Ten. He's a stud corner, but Kane Womack is headed to South Alabama to be their head coach. But Charlton Warren comes in from Georgia this season to step into that defensive coordinator role. What do you expect from Warren? And do you think the pieces are there for Indiana to have one of the best defenses in the country?
Yeah, possibly. I think there's actually quietly some pieces that they got to replace on that side of the ball that may be more impactful than what they've lost offensively. I think in particular, Jamar Johnson. I think Jamar Johnson was, just to be honest with you, probably as good of a defensive player as Indiana's had. And I don't think he's the only one that you could say this about. I think this applies to Micah McFadden. I think it applies to Tywan Mullen. But when you play that 4-2-5, what you're really trying to do is be versatile, because in modern football defense, it's not rigid like it is in a video game anymore. Like Indiana played technically a 4-down scheme, but you'd see, one end standing up probably 50-60% of the time. Now it still behaves like a 4-man front, and it still behaves like a 4-2-5. But the point is, what you're trying to do, I think, when you play that scheme, is you're trying for versatility. And Jamar Johnson could give you all of that. He tackled beyond his size. He's got great ball skills. He's incredibly athletic. He was as good as anybody Indiana had in disguising coverages. And I think that was just absolutely crucial for, when you saw Indiana lead the country in interceptions. I think by the end of the year, they were still leading the country in interceptions, even after all the bowl games. And so, replacing a guy like that will be tough. They've got some interior line depth to replace on that side of the ball. And obviously, as you talk about, they're a new coordinator to bring in. But I think the one thing that I found myself thinking a lot, and I think this is true, I'm not saying Tom Allen's Nick Saban, because he's, nobody's Nick Saban. Right. And I think I see those Auburn jerseys.
Yeah.
Behind you. My stepmother went to Auburn, so don't.
Oh, that's awesome.
I'm praising Nick Saban, but what's true of coaches like that, and just generally coaches that are successful. I think maybe Pat Fitzgerald is a good Big Ten comparison. This is Tom Allen's defense, and you can talk about personnel here and coaching, staff there and whatever, and that's going to change. And yes, better players are going to make your team better and on and on. But like the defense, as long as the head coach stays there, the defense, the structure of the defense, and the philosophy behind the defense are going to remain. And so I think that's the one piece of it that even as you talk about, well, what will Charlton Warren bring? Well, probably something different from Kane Womack. How will Indiana replace Jamar Johnson? Well, they probably won't just stick some guy in there and ask him to do everything Jamar Johnson did or everything Jerome Johnson did at the 3 technique or whatever. They'll adjust based on, different preferences and skills and whatever. But the baseline will remain. And to your point about what Indiana was defensively under Tom, before Tom Allen arrived, I don't say this flippantly, I don't think I'd ever covered a truly good Indiana defense. Some defenses that maybe could be opportunistic at times, could make some plays in the air, on the ball in the air, could pressure a little bit, but could genuinely just kind of go nose to nose with you. like the way Indiana beat Wisconsin, went up to Wisconsin. No Michael Penix, played an incredibly low scoring, grinded out, low possession game. Very much the kind of game we've been accustomed to Wisconsin winning over the last 20 years. And Indiana wins that game. That's down to individual players, but it's also down to the sort of undercurrent kind of values of, or whatever fundamentals, whatever word you want to use of that defense. And that comes from Tom Allen. And that, I think, is as long as that's there, I think Indiana's okay.
Right. And so, getting to Tom Allen, like he was brought in 2016, he's made Indiana a contender, and things are looking even more up in the future now. What makes him such a good coach, and how has he been so successful with his rebuild of this program?
To be honest, that's a question I've tried to answer for the last couple of years. I think that's been kind of the central theme of my own coverage for the last couple seasons. The one thing I come back to all the time is belief. And I know that's kind of one of those vague coach speak things, but belief is not easy at Indiana. This is the losingest Power 5 program ever. There's programs that have won more bowl games in the last 5 years than Indiana's won in its history. This is a place, obviously people say, well, basketball school and culturally this and all that. It kind of goes more fundamental than that. This is just a place that has gotten football wrong. The absent a couple really good seasons under John Pond, obviously some good football around World War II, if you want to go back that far, and then the Bill Mallory era. This is just a place that has consistently gotten football wrong up until about 2011, 2012. And when I say that, I don't just mean coaching hires. I mean the way they spend their money on it, how much they invest in it, how much they market it to alumni and boosters and try to make it sort of a centerpiece of the department's message and all that. It wasn't really till Kevin Wilson showed up that I think Indiana started asking, and I think this is where Wilson really helped Indiana. Indiana started asking, what do you do to behave like a big time football program? How do you strength train? What kind of facilities do you need? How do you evaluate in recruiting? How do you make sure that there's as much long-term value, maybe not skill, but value, and the 20th best player in your recruiting class is the second best player in your recruiting class. And I think that Indiana had built a lot of that up before Allen took over in 2016. And the infrastructure had really never been better for IU football at that point. And then I think from there, the consistent theme has just been whenever Allen needed somebody to believe in him, they did. Fred Glass, Indiana's AD at the time, hired him without a coaching search. He'd never been a head coach in college. He'd only been a college coach in any form for 10 years. He'd only been coaching at the Division I level, I think, for 6. But Fred Glass walked in the room that night in December 2016 and just said that no interim tag, no, he'll interview for the position. This is our head coach. And he took a lot of criticism for that. But obviously it's gone back in the other direction now. And, I think people like Fred are probably rightly, sort of proud that they did that. But then when you talk about a Tywone Mullen, Tywone Mullen is the brother of an Oakland Raider. He played in what we used to call the Army All-American game. Indiana had only ever had 2 Army All-Americans all time. One of those was from the state, and one was a kicker. Kids like that don't come to Indiana. And I can find you. Michael Penix picked Indiana over Florida State. Look at Florida State's quarterback situation right now and tell me that Florida State wouldn't have been thrilled to get Michael Penix, in its program in 2018. Kids like that don't pick Indiana, but they believed in Tom Allen. And when you get that belief, whether it's from your boss, your coaching staff, your players, whoever, and it's in hiring, it's in recruiting, but it's also in come in here at 6 a.m. and get better today. And, trust me when we make this play call late in the fourth quarter, whatever it is, just that fundamental belief that can be very difficult at a place that has not had much success, does not have much proof of, what happens when you do buy in. I think has just made a world of difference. And then I think the other thing with Allen too, and again, these are these intangible coach speak things, but I do think they matter, is he's stuck to it. And at times, people have made fun of the LEO mantra. They made fun of him when he had, when he had, catchphrases like breakthrough and things like that. But it never really seemed to bother him. It always felt like that stuff was for his players and his coaches. And it never felt like that stuff was for the media or, to put on a poster. And when it got lampooned, when he was going 5-7 and losing to Purdue, he stuck with it. And I think that it's a simple thing to say. It's a harder thing to do in the face of public pressure. After he went 5-7 in his second season, there were a lot of people, a lot of IU fans that felt that the program had wasted an opportunity to capitalize on those back-to-back bowls in 15 and 16. But again, the patience, the persistence, and the ability to just keep everyone involved along for the ride, I think has been it's been remarkable to see, because again, this is not a place where just a little bit of success will suddenly raise that ceiling considerably. You got to work for it at Indiana, but it's paying off for him for sure.
Right. And, I want to shift to this upcoming season. We see some new faces, some returning faces like Penix and Mullen. Who are some players, though, that we might not know about yet that you think could really shine and have their breakout season in 2021?
Why don't I go to the roster while we have this? I think there's, a couple that come to mind. One would be Miles Marshall, who is probably not going to get a ton of pub this offseason. He was Indiana's third leading receiver a year ago. He'll be a redshirt junior, or if you want to see it as a redshirt sophomore, with the way that the extra year for COVID affects things. And he's probably not going to get a ton of attention because Ty Freifogel is coming back. But he was actually quietly a really good kind of compliment to Freifogel last year. And if he he was wide open and dropped like a 58-yard touchdown pass at Wisconsin. I mean, he got over top of the defense. There was some bust in between the safeties. And if he caught that, he basically would have had Ty Freifogel's 2019 season in 2020. And I think that, Freifogel is going to be the focal point receiver because of how good he is. He's reigning Big Ten receiver of the year. But I think Marshall is a guy that quietly could be very good for this team. And if, depending on how Nick Sheridan wants to open up that passing attack, does he kind of want to have two focal boundary receivers, that kind of thing? I think Marshall's a guy that could really, I think I said Freifogel there, forgive me. I think Marshall's a guy that could stand to really benefit from that. I'm curious about both returning running backs. Stevie Scott, who's been the starter the last 3 years, is off to the NFL. Behind him, they've got a kid named Samson James, who's flashed. He was a 4-star out of Indianapolis, and IU actually flipped him from Ohio State. And he's had his moments, but I don't think he's ever really gotten consistent enough carries to really show what he can do. And then the guy next to him is Tim Baldwin, who will be a second-year player, again, however you want to see that. Had a 100-yard game against, I think, Maryland earlier this year, and a little bit more of an explosive runner, a little bit more of kind of a seams guy that puts his foot in the ground and gets up a seam. And, Indiana's brought Dylan McCullough back. He was their running backs coach for 6 seasons, and then he went to USC and then the NFL. But he was a running backs coach when both Tevin Coleman and Jordan Howard were in Indiana. And not that they're perfect comparisons, but like there's some Tevin Coleman and Tim Baldwin. There's some Jordan Howard and Samson James. And I can kind of see, I can see a little bit of that. I think I could see at least one of those guys, maybe in a year where, again, Indiana doesn't have to cut sections out of the playbook because it doesn't have time to teach them. Could take a big step forward. On defense, it is going to be interesting to really kind of get a sense for like where Indiana kind of goes next defensively. I think Sio Nfonga Tatoa, he's a one technique and a really, really good one. DeMarcus Elliott is gone now. The two of them kind of shared that one technique spot. I think Sio is a guy that is potentially going to get even more snaps and potentially take another pretty big step forward. I'm interested in DK Bonham, who's a linebacker that I think they're probably going to move more to kind of that strong side rush end position. He had some moments last year where he made some really good plays. Again, sort of spot duty. It wasn't a guy that was playing a lot, but he was in there. I think he may have had a safety. I think he recovered a fumble at one point. And as the season went on, it seemed like you started to see more of him. Like the staff was trusting him more, and he was trusting himself more, and it was all kind of coming together the way that you'd expect. And the one other one I'd throw out too is another defensive lineman named DeMarche Lewis, who Indiana actually got out of Georgia, Griffin, Georgia, south of Atlanta, and was a guy the staff really, really liked. He was a 3 technique. They just didn't have any room for him because they had 2 5th-year 3 techniques because they got a grad transfer from Stanford, and they had a 5th-year guy from within the program named Jerome Johnson who wound up playing in the Senior Bowl. So they just didn't have the snaps to give him. But I think that you could see a year on here a lot more of him. And if nothing else, I'm just intrigued to kind of see maybe more of him, even in like spring practice. We're going to be sitting up on a hill far away watching spring practice. They're not going to let us near the team, which is understandable, but at least we'll get to sit outside and watch some football. Even in a setting like spring practice, I'd be curious to see DeMarche Lewis. And, does he pop off, and do we see maybe some of the same things that the staff saw? Because it's, one of the more insignificant things that we lost, but still sort of amusing things we lost to COVID is when people would ask me last fall, who's surprising you? Who's improved? Who's stepping up? It's like, I don't know. I can't go to practice.
Right.
And so I think it's going to be really interesting. I'm looking forward to spring ball up here. It's actually been nice the last few days, highs in the 60s, and not super cold. And so I think it could be interesting to kind of run the rule over some of those young guys that, Indiana's actually had this for a couple of years now. Brought in some recruiting classes with some really promising young players, maybe more so higher ceiling players than we've seen Indiana recruit in the past. But because Indiana had so much experience on top of them, there just wasn't a lot of room for them to play. I think now that's when you're going to start seeing some of those guys. And I think Lewis is one. I think James is one. There's other guys on this roster that I think now all of a sudden it's kind of going to be their time to step into some of those bigger roles.
Right. I mean, I'm looking forward to it. I'm glad y'all get to go to spring practice. I know that has to be so frustrating to cover, can't go. And, speaking of that, now they might be opening up stadiums this next year, and the Hoosiers have a difficult schedule, to say the least. They open up in Kinnick Stadium against Iowa. They have a Cincinnati team who was a top 10, borderline top 5 team also on the schedule. They also have road trips to Penn State and Michigan, plus always the Ohio State game on the schedule, which is going to be a huge one. What do you see based on the breakout players, this tough schedule? What do you think the ceiling and or floor could be for this 2021 team?
Yeah, I mean, this is still just a little bit kind of life in the Big-10 East. I think that there are a couple of things that are interesting about this. First of all, is those first 4 games. Cincinnati looks like it's still going to be very tough. Obviously, anytime you go to Iowa, it's tough. If Indiana can get out of those first 4, maybe 3-1, certainly 4-0 would be fantastic. 3-1, I think, would still be really, really good because then, as you said, you got to go to Penn State. It's kind of hard to know what Michigan State's going to be right now. Mel Tucker's he's been dealt maybe the worst hand in the league. I think somebody pointed out he had like 1 week of off-campus recruiting. That's all he's gotten so far because of everything that's going on. And then you've got Ohio State. The one thing that when the Big Ten reshuffled its schedule, the one thing that did happen for Indiana is they got off this rotation where because they play an unbalanced home away schedule. They play a 9-game schedule in the Big Ten. So every year Indiana either had 5 home games and played Penn State and Michigan State at home, or had 4 home games and played Michigan and Ohio State at home. And historically, it's not like Indiana's had a ton of success against any of those 4 programs, but they've been more competitive with Penn State and Michigan State. And so it's kind of all or nothing in a way because even if the playing field was a little more level, it still sort of felt like those 4 home game years, you already dealt 2 losses in the Big Ten at home. And they've broken that up now. So Michigan State and Ohio State will be the home games going forward in the rotation during 4 4 home game seasons, and Penn State and Michigan will be in the 5 home game seasons. I think the other thing that's kind of interesting for Indiana is, and again, we don't know. I'm always hesitant. I mean, 2 years ago when Indiana went 8-4, we looked at their schedule and we said they got to go to Nebraska. They got to play the reigning Big-10 West champions in Northwestern. That's a really tough schedule. And then they wound up going 8-4 and basically beating everybody except Michigan State, Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State. But I think one thing that is interesting for Indiana is, especially if you can get off to a strong start there in the first 4 games, again, maybe like 3-1, your last 5 are at Maryland, at Michigan, Rutgers, Minnesota, at Purdue. So only one of your last 5 is one of those, sort of quote unquote big 4 in the Big Ten East. And it's probably a big 3 right now. Michigan State's kind of fallen behind, but only one of your last 5 is one of those sort of Big Ten East programs that everybody's always concerned with reckoning with. And I think that if Indiana can get itself into a place where, let's say they're even like 4-3 going into those last 5, then another 8-win season, I think, is very realistic. And I know, listen, I know there are IU fans who will say, well, came so close to winning the Big Ten East last season, that should be the expectation again this season. And internally, that they probably feel that way. But I also think that from a neutral perspective, sort of an objective perspective, what Indiana needs more than anything else is to develop a culture of winning. Again, this is a program that for so long it was synonymous with just being bad football, constantly at the bottom of the league, or maybe 10th out of 11 teams, or 9th out of 11 teams, trying to squeak out 6 wins a year. You've got a program here now that's gone to bowl games in 4 of the last 6 years, that has owned its rivalry against its in-state rival recently, that is recruiting at a better level, spending at a higher level, hiring at a higher level than it ever has before. The higher you can achieve, the better. But I think the baseline just needs to be establishing a culture of winning, and just where, like, suddenly one day you look up and you say, in the last 8 years, Indiana's been to 6 bowls, and all of a sudden they're recruiting top 30 classes, and the only time they're losing coaches, it's to absolute top 5 programs or to the NFL, because that's what has made it so hard. I mean, in college football, it very much is that chicken and egg thing, like what can come first. But once you've got a little bit of that, I don't think you can suddenly just say, well, if we don't now succeed at an even higher level, it's a failure. It's more a way of saying, we've raised the floor on this. How do we cement that and sort of get to a point where just culturally the floor is bowl games, and then you can build, again, on top of that. So I think a good season for Indiana next year would be 8-4, 9-3. A great season would be anything beyond that. I'm just a little hesitant to kind of say, oh, Indiana could pop up and, beat Ohio State to the East, when you've got question marks about Michael Penix, about quietly a number of guys that have gone on to the NFL or elected not to use their that extra COVID year. But I still think it's a team that is more than good enough to see in the bowl field, finishing with a winning record, pushing, almost playing as maybe a peer to your Penn States and your Michigans and your Michigan States in a year where I don't necessarily think any one of those programs can just assume that they are the class of the conference either.
Right. And, last question here. I love asking this question. I haven't been able to make it up to a game in Memorial Stadium yet, but just covering the team, being around the program, what makes Bloomington, that city, Memorial Stadium, such a unique environment on game days?
Well, the old joke is that 100,000 people come tailgate and only 35,000 of them go to the stadium. I think what's going to be interesting is to see there's undeniably been more interest and excitement around IU football the last couple of years, even going back to 2019 in terms of attendance, and the thing IU's always fought is getting all those people into the stadium. But I don't know that that's necessarily going to be as big of a problem if we're back to full attendance by fall 2021. But I mean, genuinely, as somebody who grew up in SEC country, I grew up in Atlanta. From a tailgate perspective, it's very similar. I mean, it's all the lots are full, It spreads out for a mile in every direction around the stadium. And I mean, if you basically those like crisp fall days from like late October to the end of the season down in SEC country, that's what Bloomington has from mid-September on. And again, maybe it doesn't always filter all the way into Memorial Stadium, but you definitely get the just a very sort of collegial football vibe. And if you want to have some fun, there are certainly places, there are certainly lots and fields, certain spots you can hit to keep things lively on game day. So, and Memorial Stadium, the other thing too to say about Memorial Stadium is it only seats about 53. It's I don't think Indiana ever really wants it to be much bigger. I think Indiana's okay with having a smaller stadium that's a little bit easier to get full and make it feel cozy. But I think that they have closed in both the north and the south end zones for basically more team facilities in the last 10 years. And it's gone from looking like a glorified high school stadium to looking like a genuine, sort of aesthetically pleasing Big-10 stadium as well. And I think that's gone hand in hand with not necessarily, getting more fans in or whatever, but certainly recruiting better, staffing better. It's again, when Indiana's maybe been able to say we're more serious about football and you don't have to take our word for it because here's us putting our money where our mouth is.
Right. And I definitely want to get up to a game. Hopefully, this year. I would love to come to the Cincinnati game. I have some people I know in Indiana, Ohio area now, so I have somewhere to go. So hopefully I can make it out to a game pretty soon. But man, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come on the podcast, talk Indiana football with me. Where can our listeners find you? Where can they find anything you do that you want to plug and get some more eyes on?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me too. It's always fun talking football. Like I said, it's indystar.com/sports, indystar.com/sports, or I guess my Twitter handle, ZACHOSTERMAN. So, like I said, I mean, IU football's hot right now. Never thought I'd say that. never thought I'd say IU football was cooler than IU basketball, but it undeniably is right now. And it's going to be interesting to see kind of where these next couple seasons go, because I think it even as much as I talk about, not raising expectations too fast, they are raised. They are still raised. And I think that the question for Indiana is, how do you keep sort of making these incremental improvements when maybe they get a little bit harder to make year on year?
Right. I mean, we covered so many Indiana games this year on the podcast. We picked like 6 to 10 of the biggest games of the week. And I think over half the weeks of the year, we had an Indiana game. And I never thought, we were picking Indiana games over SEC games, and we're an SEC-based podcast, me and my co-host that does most of the regular season with me, and both from Mobile, Alabama. So most of our listening base is down there, but man, we were covering Indiana the whole time. We both were just obsessed with what Michael Penix was doing. Tywan Mullen was one of my breakout players this year. So I've been keeping up with Indiana, man, and it's definitely exciting. But I appreciate you coming, guys. We'll be back later this week with another episode. Y'all know where y'all can find us. We're going to continue our Big 10 and 31 days later this week. But for Zach and the Blue Bloods, we are out.